Hello, everybody. Welcome to Spirit Gem with Paul Chek. Today, our guest is Madhava Setty. I'm excited to have him back. Our title today is 911, a catalyst for awakening now. And before you start thinking, oh my God, 911, that's so old and outdated, trust me when I tell you, there's a reason we're having this podcast, and we'll see as we go how this directly relates to all the issues we're dealing with in the world right now. Madhava has served as a writer and science director for Children's Health Defense newsletter and is the science advisor to the International Center for 911 Justice. You can visit this important organization, which is shared in the show notes, c911.org. So if you really want to get some deep factual information, I recommend you go there. Some of you may have heard my previous podcast with Madhava, which got a lot of fantastic feedback. And we spoke about his excellent book, Woke, An Anesthesiologist's View. And today we're going to get into the issues of how people's minds are being hijacked by planned illusions and connect the dots from 911 to COVID and all the relevant issues today. Madhava will explain how 911 may have been one of the initial moves toward a global world government by wiping out freedoms and other related issues. We will give you plenty of tips on how to counter the hijacking of the mind and of the individual and collective mind, so it's beneficial to listeners instead of just feeling hopeless, which is easy to feel today, but we're too strong, us Spirit Gym listeners and practitioners, for feeling hopeless. Every challenge is an opportunity. I say, aho, great spirit. So we also want to have a gestalt, and that's another thing Madhava is going to help us with, is have a gestalt or a framework for how to recognize false flags, face news, and stay centered, and learn where the reliable news sources are and how to effectively filter the BS. First of all, Madhava will spell out a 12-step process he uses when approaching a divisive topic, and then together we will apply it to the 911 event. We have put together the media links and images in a PDF document you can find in your show notes. So if you're listening on a listening device and not watching video, you can actually see all the images and you can have the URLs to all the videos we're going to share in this podcast. So with that long introduction, Madhava, welcome back. It's always fantastic to share dialogue with you, my friend.
Well, thank you for having me back on your podcast, Paul. I really enjoyed our last conversation. And as I, delve deeply into the work you're doing on Spirit Gym and the Institute, I've learned much more about you and the level of interest you take in mastery of a subject. So I am grateful to you for allowing me to speak to your audience.
Thank you. Yes, I put a lot of effort into my work for sure. To begin with, Madhava, you state that 911 provides an exercise in critical thinking and synthesis. Can you please overview the key points of the event 911 that can be used for critical thinking and synthesis with relevance to the issues of the world that started with COVID and continue hot and heavy to this very moment?
I'd like to begin by starting with the COVID pandemic, just briefly to contextualize this. And early on in the early months of 2020, unlike my own physician colleagues, I was extremely suspicious of the pandemic response. And that was primarily because I did not fall into the delusion that my physician colleagues fell into, which was they would never do bad things to us. And this is chiefly because of my investigation into 9/11, which had started several years before. And to speak briefly in comparison to the COVID pandemic response and 9/11, it is far, far easier to see the deception behind 9/11. The COVID pandemic, or pandemic, if you will, is very, very complicated in order to really get to the bottom of what is true and what isn't. Because, for example, I'll offer this to your audience. The estimated number of excess deaths in 2020 was about 350 to 400,000 deaths in the United States. Now, that seems like a large number. These are deaths in excess of what we would expect for that year. The reality is about 1 in 110 people die every year. And so when you add in this country, so when you add an additional 325,000 deaths, you're now talking about approximately 1 in 100 people dying. There is no way for you or I to have a personal experience to look around and say, holy cow, people are dying all around us. There's something going on. If honestly, if we weren't being told there was a pandemic in place, it would be very hard for us to have a personal experience about the fact that something terrible is happening. And we don't have to go into the distortions around the numbers right now. But my point being is that it's very difficult to see with your own eyes. 9/11, on the other hand, you don't need much background. You just need to have an open mind and to have some basic understanding of how the physical world behaves reliably in order to see where the deception is. So that's how I would frame this right now. And this is why I believe 9/11, though it happened 23 years ago, is more pivotal now more than ever because we are being bombarded with misinformation left and right. And I think we're going to tie it together as we proceed through this process of sense making to see how they're all related.
I don't know at what point exactly in the COVID pandemic this became a reality, but I completely agree that with only one person dying in 100 or 110, that's not something that's easy to see.
Exactly.
I mean, if you were at a football game with 60,000 people and all of a sudden one in every 100 died, you would notice people dropping because you'd have 60 plus thousand people there. So you'd notice, hey, wow, there's a lot of people passing out all of a sudden. But at some point, I know from personal experience, because as you know, I'm teaching classes to students all the time. So I oftentimes have anywhere from 30 to 60 people. But it got to the point where there wasn't a single time when I didn't run into somebody or teach a class where somebody in the class hadn't had someone in their family or someone they knew personally die during the pandemic. And it got to the point where I actually started asking people in classes, how many of you have a family member that's either been badly injured or has died since the pandemic started? And every
Mhm.
single hand in the room would go up.
Mhm.
So either it was a close friend or a coworker or a family member. So it actually reached a snowball effect where the point I'm making is when you get a bunch of people in the room and you start asking them specific questions, all of a sudden people look around the room and go, oh my God, this is just not an unusual thing. Everybody here knows somebody that's either seriously injured or dead.
I would also add that the real data is being held by institutions like the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. They are the arbiters of what is actually going on. And in my experience as a physician, I've always trusted that institution up to the year 2020, when a deep dive into how they calculate things like vaccine effectiveness, how they dictate the numbers of COVID deaths are tabulated. And there is some distortion there. And I don't want to take our time to go through all of the nitty gritty, but I've written about this extensively for Children's Health Defense and my own Substack. So there is a lot here. And exactly, you're making the point that I'm trying to make, which is it's complicated and it's not easy for the average person to see. And we're also relying on data that may not be valid. And this is, by the way, is a big challenge for my colleagues in medicine to even challenge the fact that the CDC may be being deceptive. But we have to at least avail ourselves of the reality that the CDC's budget is largely or significantly supported by a for profit industry called Big Pharma, as well as the regulatory budget for the FDA. So I'm not suggesting that this is the reason why they're wrong. It takes a very, very deep dive. But as opposed to the COVID pandemic, we can take a much closer and deeper look at 9/11, and the evidence of deception, I believe, is going to be in your face. And that's what I hope to do here, because I think it's much easier to make sense of these false narratives with regards to 9/11.
I think that's true. And I think there's another point I'd like to make in that regard, and that is the same people that have the power to pull off a deception the size of 911 are definitely still involved in anything of that scale. And they certainly haven't gone to another planet or rolled over and played dead. So I think one of the key messages here is that we have to realize that if there's this level of corruption and manipulation at the level of 911, and it's been 20 something years, and we know technology doubles itself every 18 months or faster, and these people have the money and own most of the technologies. So they certainly are not going to not up their game. But before we move on, you have this nice list of 12 ways of relating, embrace uncertainty, and things like that. Did you want to share that?
Yes, this is my approach, and I'd like to talk you through it. And for the audience, first of all, we're going to hopefully use this 12-step process as we approach 9/11, which is why I think this conversation is going to be really revelatory for people who have not looked into the subject. What I would like to do first is offer you what the mainstream orthodoxy is suggesting for a 10-step process. And what I'm going to share with you right now, I'm just going to read it off. This is from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association, which is obviously a branch of the US government. And it reflects pretty much all academic institutions, because they've taken a great interest in making sure the public does not fall for false narratives. Academic institutions have put forward more or less the same advice to the public. And this is their 10-step process. And if you want to, as an audience member, go and Google identifying fake news, and it will all of the references will pretty much say the same thing, more or less. So this is what they say. One, do a visual assessment of the overall design of the site that you're reading from. Fake news sites often look amateurish and have lots of annoying ads and use altered or stolen images. So, does the website itself look to be of high quality? I think that's a pretty reasonable piece of advice. Number two, check the web domain. Mainly fake news URLs look odd or end with .com.co or .lo to mimic legitimate news sites. Also, very good advice. Three, check the About Us section. Trustworthy news outlets usually include detailed background information, policy statements, and email contacts in the About Us section. Do they provide that kind of background? Four, identify the author. In other words, fake news articles don't identify the author, or they have anonymous. The author name is left anonymous. I think that's a very, very good piece of advice. So far, 4 for 4. Five, assess spelling, grammar, and punctuation. Six, identify the central message and read the article carefully. Fake news articles often push one viewpoint, have an angry tone, or make outrageous claims. Does the article seem fair, balanced, and reasonable? I think this is also very good advice. Our tone is very important when we're communicating with other people, especially about information that could be very provocative. Number seven, analyze source and quotes. Consider the article's sources and who is quoted. Fake news articles often cite anonymous sources, unreliable sources, or no sources at all. Does the article include and identify reliable sources? Now, this is where things get a little bit murky, in my opinion. How does one know if a source is reliable? That's the central question that's never really addressed fully yet. 8. Find other articles and search the internet for more articles on the same topic. If you can't find any, chances are the story is fake. Are there multiple articles by other news outlets on this topic? See, they're making an assumption, which is that the information, if true, would be widely reported. This assumption precludes the possibility that there is misinformation that is widely reported. Here we go. It gets even more interesting. 9. Identify the news outlet. The Wall Street Journal and CNN are examples of news outlets. If you haven't heard of the news outlet, search online for more information. Is the news outlet well known, well respected, and trustworthy? What are your thoughts on that, Paul?
Basically, what I've found is the best information usually comes from non-standard sources. Like, I remember once I read an excellent paper on cosmology that came from the University of Granada
Mm-hmm.
by a cosmologist, but he stated in the introduction to his paper that no major university would support him or let him do his PhD project there because his project basically showed that the Big Bang Theory was incorrect.
Yep.
Therefore, anything that goes against the major outlets or media or university, shall we say, dogma is pushed into the fringes. So oftentimes you actually have to go to out of the way places. And another example of this is during the pandemic, I tried to educate my family with reliable sources, and I sent them all greenmedinfo.com and Children's Health Defense. And one of the first comments I got back, probably at least 3 times, was, those are fringe news sources. Those are not reliable sources. And family members were saying, this is what I learned on CNN or whatever. So the paradox is, it turns out to be that the very sites that have clean websites, that have about us, are actually often the generators of information that fits the criteria on this list for determining if it's a credible source, but are actually just better at deceiving people.
They're asking us to trust the fact that the Wall Street Journal and CNN, the two that they cite here, are legitimate news sources. And I would say most people would agree that they are. They're not some kind of fringy platforms, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be accurate and honest. And this is a very important part of this because for most people, if you start saying that you don't believe mainstream media sources, then you get automatically jettisoned into a bucket of people who are extremists or fringe. And the reality is, as hopefully your audience will know, is that you can't necessarily trust every source all the time. And these are platforms that take in a tremendous amount of revenue from their advertisers. And it would be very difficult, I would imagine, for a managing editor at CNN to run a story that, say, would put vaccine manufacturers or pharma into a place where they have to defend themselves or are critical of what they're putting forward. So I think it's actually naive to assume that everything that's coming from legacy media is going to be true for that reason. But on the other hand, it also makes it very difficult for people to accept that these news sources may not be telling you the truth, because that is actually our window or our eyes on reality. What happens if we cannot trust our news sources? It's a very, very difficult position to be put in. And I would suggest that they're offering the Wall Street Journal and CNN without acknowledging that they could be actually not telling you the truth. We just sort of, they're implying that we need to trust these people because they're legitimate news sources. And finally, I'm going to tell you number 10. This is what's really interesting. This is like, when all else fails, go to 10, which is turn to fact checkers.
Oh,
Fact check,
Jesus.
right? Factcheck.org, Snopes.com, and PolitiFact.com are widely trusted fact checking websites. Do the fact checkers say the news story is true? Yeah, so this is when we need to laugh for a second. And I don't even know how to really respond to this, but let's just ask ourselves, like, who do you think is behind Snopes.com? Who's behind factcheck.org?
Hi, everybody. Have you ever wondered why your blood is red? It's because it's full of oxygen and life force. It's what keeps you going. But what if I could tell you about something else that's red that will add more life force and keep you going? And if you start with a red juice before you have coffee or tea and wait a few minutes, you might find that you either don't need the coffee or the tea, or you need less of it. But this time, instead of getting coffee and tea, you got a lot of nutrition and a lot of great stuff for stress management and detoxification. And it's so important. I got Drew Canole. It took me 2 years to get him to come hang out with me and talk about this. I said, Drew, tell me more about your red juice. And he is right here to tell us what is on with your red juice. My kids love it. Everybody I know loves it.
Well, I love that we have it for kids, because
Yes.
when I was a kid, there was this big red dude that would burst through a brick wall, and he was like, oh, yeah. And he would feed me a glass of 50 grams of sugar, giving most people diabetes,
Yeah.
ADHD,
Yeah.
addiction,
Obesity.
all the things, right?
Yeah.
So when we created Red, it was, what's the alternative?
Mm-hmm.
If we could create something that could create lasting stamina, lasting energy, and then we started to look at our ancient ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about the Vikings, the
Mhm.
people that were rowing across the oceans for days
Yeah.
to go to war.
Yeah.
What were they taking? Well, they were taking rhodiola.
Yeah.
Rhodiola is in our red juice.
Yeah.
And then we were like, okay, so out of all the mushrooms,
Yeah.
what's one of the best medicinal mushrooms that can give us long-lasting energy?
Mm.
We found cordyceps. Cordyceps are absolutely amazing.
Yes.
Not just any cordyceps or rhodiola, glyphosate residue-free and organic.
Mhm.
And how can we make it taste better than the, oh yeah, how do we make it taste better than that without the sugar?
Yeah.
We added a little monk fruit.
Monk
And
fruit's amazing.
Yep, and we found the best berries on the planet.
Mm.
Berries in high amounts, which we have in the red juice, actually help increase stem cell creation in your body.
Mm.
What's better than that for our little ones and for us?
Yes.
And so many people are just lethargic. They're lacking energy.
Yes.
What could we do for that? Red juice in the afternoon, 2 p.m. rolls around, instead of a nap, instead of the coffee, drink the red juice. You're going to feel so much better.
Well, if you need the nap, take the nap if you can, but then take the red juice to kick you back into gear.
Exactly. I love naps, and I love coffee.
I do too, but I love to make sure I got the nutrition in me first. The other thing is berries are a natural stimulant to the adrenal glands. So if people would do a little red juice before they do coffee and tea, they would pick themselves up naturally, except this time they're bringing in nutrition. And unfortunately, coffee blocks almost every vitamin and mineral you can put in your mouth. So, hey, there you have it, right from the man himself.
To try Organifi's red juice and get 20% off your order, go to Organifi.com/Chek20 and use the promo code Chek20 at checkout. That's Organifi.com/CHEK20 and the promo code is CHEK20 for a 20% discount.
One of the things that wasn't mentioned so far in the determining what fake news is, which really could be said finding reliable sources, is two things. One, I've seen numerous interviews and documentaries making it dead clear that the CIA has operatives in all the major media outlets across the United States and the world, including news anchors. So that's the organization that said our job will be done when no one knows what the truth is, right? That's published. And then the other fact is that one of the ways I indicate a fake news source is when everybody's saying exactly the same thing and they're not allowing any counterpoints to be surfaced. And so what you have really is a scripted monologue. And I'm sure everybody here saw many videos showing television screens all over the world saying exactly the same things, like little robots. And yet these are the media sources they're claiming to tell us are reliable. And then the other fact is, I know Elon Musk and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and others I know investigated a lot of these fact checkers and found out that it was people that had no education whatsoever and anything to do with what they were fact checking. So all of this really points to the bigger issue that we have going on. And I think that's really what the conversation today is, to try to lay the groundwork for and say, look, let's go to an event where we can actually see when they really, shall we say, went from being in the shadows to putting it right in your face.
For the audience, Paul, is referring to Project Mockingbird, which is a very old and revealed effort by our CIA to infiltrate our media sources. And I believe even as early as the mid 70s, they were being asked to, first of all, acknowledge that that was being done, which they did. And I forgot who the director was back then, but or the person who was responding to the congressional investigation, they also admitted that it was still an ongoing process, and and they wanted to answer those questions, specific questions, offline in executive session. So the idea here, and as you mentioned, Paul, their stated objective, is that their job will be done when nobody knows what to believe. And this is our central intelligence agency openly stating that. Now, I would also like to make this very clear because in my experience, I'm extremely careful as I'm opening up a subject. And for those of you who might be listening that don't believe that Elon Musk is trustworthy or Robert F. Kennedy is trustworthy with regard to their investigation into fact checking, I'm just offering this to your audience, which is, let's just look at this with logic. Do we really imagine that there is a group of highly trained experts who are taking the time out of their hands, out of their lives to go and do the research for you with no pay? There's no one influencing them. There's nobody that's paying the kind of salary that they could command in the private sector. And they're just sitting there looking over stories and deciding what's true and what isn't for you. I mean, I hope we can understand that is a very, very naive perspective to take. So you don't have to necessarily trust Bobby Kennedy or Elon Musk or whoever, or Sherry Tenpenny that you mentioned. The idea that we have a fact-checking organization that's out there to do the hard work for you is absurd.
Of course it is. It's like someone going to the gym for you. How's that going to work?
Yeah.
If you don't have enough esprit de corps and initiative to check into things for yourself, then really you're still in the child archetype and you're letting anybody be your mommy, daddy, school teacher, God figure. And
Mhm.
that's exactly what got everybody in deep trouble, from the medical doctors to the scientists to everybody else, even government officials.
I play the guitar. I'm an amateur guitar player, and I, thankfully I have a income that allows me to buy an instrument if I want. And I always kid that I haven't found the perfect guitar yet because I'm looking for one where I can improve without practicing.
Well, if you do, don't tell me about it.
Yeah. So I offer this thing to you and your audience, which is how the mainstream orthodoxy would like you to make sense of things. And now I'm going to offer your audience my approach, and I'm just going to list them. I'll be very, very succinct. One, embrace uncertainty, and we'll talk about this in a second. Two, sharpen your powers of observation. Three, use your imagination as a tool. Four, familiarize yourself with relevant scientific principles. Five, use source documents, not third party analyses of them. Six, identify the central questions and understand how they are being answered. Seven, assess the initial coverage of an event. Eight, compare the initial coverage to the narrative that is presently held. Nine, identify any contradictions in the narrative. 10, identify a better alternative explanation. 11, cui bono. In other words, ask yourself who benefits from the narrative we're being asked to ingest. And 12, contextualize the event. So before applying this topic to the conversation of 9/11, I want people to note that nowhere have I mentioned anything about outsourcing your sense making to a trusted third party. And neither am I suggesting that I am the authority on sense making. You and I are in the same camp, Paul, because like with you and your students or your patients, I'm only inviting your listeners to try my approach. And if it doesn't work, call me out and, find another approach. So you have to be the judge of it yourself, but that's my approach.
There's something we should all remember. It's sometimes called the 5 W's of effective thinking.
Hmm.
And those W's are who, what, why, when, where, and then how. Who is saying this and who's it relevant to? What is it about and what is it proposing? Why? Why is this happening? Why is this an event? Etc. The why question. Where is it relevant? Where did it happen? And when did it happen? And how does it apply? How does this medicine apply? How does this happen? Those questions, if they're left, any of them are left unanswered, is like having a hole in your gas tank. It's dangerous no matter what. Even if it's a tiny pinhole, it only takes one spark to hit a gasoline fume and off you go.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think if we just remember the simple rule, who, what, why, when, where, how, and always apply that, especially to things that are potentially life-threatening, as we've been through in the last 4.5 years. And I think also your third point here was use your imagination as a tool. Einstein said imagination is more important than thinking. Thinking is almost always a reproduction of somebody else's ideas, with rare exceptions, unless you're one of the few people that has legitimately novel thoughts. And novel thoughts are only useful for people that understand at least the basic principles of any science or practice, or a novel thought can just be pie in the sky if you don't have the foundation principles to work with on the subject you're dealing with. But I think using our imagination is like connecting the dots,
Mm-hmm.
and the old saying, if it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck.
That's right.
But sometimes we have to use our imagination, kind of like a detective, put this note on the board, this picture on the board, and then you stand back, and then the imagination looks at it, and it does something the rational mind can't do, because it's a right brain process. It starts tying all the pieces together, and at least it starts throwing up more questions like, okay, well, if this and this and this connects, but how do these two connect?
Mm-hmm.
So we can let our imagination, really imagination means image in action. So we're allowing images to come into us and we're putting them into action. That's really how we capture the flow of the now. We take images of it. So our brain is an image generator. That's what the left brain does. It takes a piece of the flow of the now that the right brain's in touch with. Like I think it was Heraclitus said, you cannot stand in the same river twice. So the right brain is in the river of the flow of the now, and the left brain captures pieces of it. So when we're using our imagination, we're taking the images, so to speak, that we have, and we're emptying ourselves and allowing our intention to guide what pops up onto the screen of our mind, and then go, oh, geez, I didn't think of that. Or, oh, and that's really how imagination works. And that's what it's for. That's most people's perception of imagination is, oh, I'm going to imagine an elephant with 6 trunks and the mouth of a tiger and a VW bug's back end on it. That's certainly imagination, but that's not really imagination in the context of constructive thinking or problem solving. That's really more fantasy.
Well said. I like to think that knowledge is knowing where all the dots are, and wisdom is understanding how they fit together. And this is where, you must be in the flow. You must have a focus of attention that is not simply pinpoint, but is also very broad. And that is very difficult for the left brain. But we have that power. And I believe that we're being subtly pushed towards abandoning that.
Yeah.
And so this is and I think you're going to find it very interesting how we can use our imagination as we're unpacking the 9/11 narrative that we've been told to swallow for 23 years.
You had said next that you wanted to share some important thoughts about embracing uncertainty.
Oh yeah. Yes.
And
Oh,
and I, when I read your list, I said this is the equivalent of stretching before engaging physical activity. So ask yourself, are you 100% sure your understanding of the topic at hand is correct? If so, ask yourself, what would it take to change your mind? So, this is a powerful pointer that can reveal the roots of your belief system. So I really thought this was important for embracing uncertainty. So if you'd like to share any thoughts you had in that regard, please do.
This is a important step, and that's why it's the first step. Remaining comfortable with not knowing with 100% certainty is an incredible power because it allows you to expand your understanding at any given moment as long as you're open to the possibility that you're wrong. And I believe that we very quickly conflate 100% certainty with being almost certain. And it doesn't matter where you stand with regard to a position or a topic, whether you're 100% certain or almost certain, but ask yourself how or what you would need to see in order to change your mind. And let's be real here. The first thing I suggest is perhaps you are certain because of a direct experience. And we have direct experiences. Nobody's going to be able to convince you that you're not having pain when you're having pain. But here we're talking about apprehending what's going on in the world. We're dealing with thought forms and perspectives. So a lot of what we're about to approach, there's going to be another perspective. And so there should be some openness and flexibility in how you are approaching the subject. And I believe that asking yourself, what would it take to change your mind is a very important question to ask oneself. Because more often than not, it will be, let's say with regard to 9/11, if you believe the conventional story, ask yourself, would you still believe the conventional story if the New York Times told you that the buildings were blown up? Would you still stick to the gravitational collapses and plane collisions? Or would you change your mind if the New York Times said that, oh, wow, we found some information now that actually the buildings were blown up by whomever? Most people, with regard to these kinds of things, generally allow our trusted institutions to tell us what happened. And that is an incredible amount of loyalty or trust that we place in a third party. And the point I'm trying to make here is that the source that you believe could be fallible. Why would the Times be infallible, or NPR, or Fox News, or whoever? So understanding that your position is based in a third party's analysis is important because it allows you to change your mind if that third party changes its mind. So you're not 100% certain because unless you give infallibility to those particular sources.
Well, I think another point too is that, so much of the things that people in our culture hang their hat on have some sort of a scientific credential to them. Like, oh, science says this about this or this medicine or procedure, or science says this about 911 or whatever. But the reality of it is that science is the pursuit of truth, and it is the open willingness to challenge any existing truth to find a better truth, or more, something that's even more true. So I think from a scientific perspective, it's important for us all to remember that, no matter how sure we are of what we know now, if we are doing real science, we're actually always interested to see if we can defeat the existing truth for a higher truth.
Yep.
And I think one of the issues here is we really have to be conscious of the fact that when you state that you believe something, it usually means you've stopped asking questions. And so I think, when I use the word belief, on the inside, I'm saying my current belief is, but it's open to change when some better evidence comes along. I mean, there's lots of things in my life I believed, but later found out that that belief was only partially correct, or situationally correct, or incorrect. And I was often stunned when I figured out why.
Those are great moments in our life, in our process as we experience this incarnation, is those kinds of events. And you're hitting on something very important, which is belief. And I would suggest that believing means, in general, you are open to changing your mind, as opposed to knowing, which connotes the idea that you're aware of an immutable fact. And we often get those two confused. and I come up with an example for your audience. And I think we may have actually hit upon this the last time we had a conversation, the difference between believing and knowing. But what you're saying here is incredibly important. And I would add that every scientist that has come up with a new discovery is just waiting for it to be overturned because they know it will be eventually. Um, so yet we've been told for 4 years to trust the science, and now obviously people are backpedaling, saying, "Well, we did what we could when we knew it," and there are many problems with that defense. But anyway, here we are.
Most of us were educated in schools and in media sources that the speed of light is constant and does not change. But in Rupert Sheldrake's book, Setting Science Free, he brings up 10 key paradigms where science has actually conditioned you to believe that these are absolute facts. And he actually publishes the fact that the speed of light changes quite regularly. It fluctuates quite up and down. And he went directly to one of the few people in the world that's tasked with measuring the speed of light. And he showed, no, it is not a constant, it's fluctuating. And when Rupert Sheldrake presented at TED, right after he wrote the book and was promoting the book and sharing this information, they basically took his presentation down, and it caused a huge uproar. And ultimately, they moved it to another website and then ended up getting, I don't know, over 2 billion views after TED shut him down because he was sharing fundamental truths about exactly the kinds of issues that we're talking about here. But when you hear it from a hardcore scientist who's published hundreds of papers and world famous for his work, you know that this is not a guy who's just pissing on science to be an asshole. He's actually telling you these are the fundamental ways that your mind is being taken over because you're believing stuff. And here's 10 definite aspects of science where that's happened. So I think, we need to constantly look for people that have the credibility to push the edge and illuminate the darkness where most people are conditioned not to look. Very few people would challenge the concept that the speed of light is a constant. But it takes somebody of Rupert Sheldrake's depth to look into it. And then you see there's 9 other areas that's just as flimsy in science.
Are you ready to switch careers to one where you can help others to look great, feel great, and create their dreams? Or maybe you're already a health and fitness professional and are called to elevate your skills and knowledge and learn to address the whole person with genuine, tried and tested holistic approaches? If so, then now is the time to apply for the Chek Academy, and enrollment is open for the fall intake. The Chek Academy offers you everything you need to master a holistic approach to helping people, practical skill development, personal coaching principles, business building tools, and much more. Developed by Paul Chek himself, shaped into an easy-to-follow program of study by the Chek Institute CEO, Gavin Jennings, using the strategies he created to build a highly successful multidisciplinary clinic, and taught by experts in the industry, the Chek Academy is your next step to a fulfilling career. If you're switching to a new career path, you can learn the basics effectively and efficiently and begin making an income doing what you love to do. As your clientele builds and you progress in the Chek Academy, you can cut back on your old job and more fully engage a new rewarding career in holistic health. For those already working as exercise or healthcare professionals, then this is your path to achieve mastery of your craft and become the best in your field. Ready to take the next step and want to see what the Chek Academy can offer you? The open house allows you a sneak peek into the learning system and courses in the Chek Academy. But this opportunity is only open for a limited time, and there are only 100 spaces for this fall intake. So head on over to chek.group/ChekL4D and see what the Chek Academy can offer you. That's chek.group/CHEKL4D. Don't waste another year wondering if you should join. Check it out now and take the next step in your professional development.
So we talked about embracing uncertainty and the importance of that. So the second point is to sharpen your powers of observation. And what I'd like to do now is offer your viewing audience a picture. We are looking at one of the Twin Towers, I will first say this for the folks who are on your podcast and listening. What we see here is a an image that's probably taken from maybe 3/4 of a mile away of the North Tower. This is the first tower that was struck and the second one to fall. And I will say also that this is one frame out of a sequence, which we'll put up next. But what I'm seeing here is it looks like the top of the building is covered in an enormous plume of smoke and debris. And is it falling down or is it blowing up? But what can we tell from this image?
Well, the first thing that strikes me is you've got two different things that seem to be happening at once. In the central column, you've got smoke clearly rising, and then on the outskirts, you've got a ring of debris that's clearly falling.
What I would like to bring to your attention here is in the minds of most people who believe the conventional narrative, the top of the building was supposed to be crushing the bottom part of the building. Where is the top part of the building here? Granted, it could be hidden and obscured by the smoke. It could be, but it also is conspicuously absent. And as we proceed here, I also want to make note of the fact that before we capitulate to the idea that our eyes can deceive, the bulk of NIST's investigation, and NIST is the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. It is a branch of the US Department of Commerce, and they were tasked to give us the technical explanation of why these buildings collapsed. That story is coming from NIST, that there was a pile driver or a structural block that should be crushing the rest of the building down. And I don't see it. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. I'm saying that from this image alone, we can't tell. This should give us reason to pause. Now, let's look at the 11-second clip of from where this particular image was taken. The interesting part here was if you look closely, and again, I'm asking the audience to sharpen your powers of observation. Watch what happened to the top part of the building. I don't know if you caught that or not. The crush zone did not fall. The top part of the building was destroyed as it was as the building collapsed. So the top part, which is supposed to be the causative agent of the destruction of the bottom part, was being blown up first.
14 stories is 140 feet.
That's
a
right.
lot of building.
That's a lot of building, and I can't see it. You see it in the beginning, but you don't see it within a few seconds.
It's breaking down from right at the level of the impact, not
That's
at the top
right.
at all.
Mm-hmm. So that's important to note. We see it looking like it's being destroyed. Moreover, as you saw, there was an enormous amount of debris that was being expelled outward as the building fell. The point there is that material was no longer available to crush the rest of the building. It's being expelled outward. So here we are, two guys that neither of us are architects, but there is a lot to be taken just from that 11-second clip alone. And Paul, I don't know if you remember this or not, but I do, which is in the first couple of days following 9/11, those events, the news was showing the collapse of the buildings over and over and over again, endlessly. And then 2 days later, more or less, suddenly all of that went away. And we were told that in the interest of not,
traumatizing viewers.
Yes, we were no longer going to show that anymore. And we're about to see something a little bit later on that is going to irrefutably show you that there was many things that were being shown in those videos that they didn't want you to see. Oh, the other point here is, does the bottom of the building, the thing that's supposed to have been crushed, does it look like it was compromised as it fell? It looks to me that it was completely intact. There was no distortion of any of the corners. There were no massive fires going on in the intact part of the building. And we're talking about 96 floors of building that was essentially undamaged. NIST will tell you that some of the jet fuel somehow managed to avoid being ignited and got into the elevator shafts or some story like that. But most of the building looks very strong.
Well, yes, and I saw multiple interviews with engineers that actually designed those buildings, and they said they were specifically designed to take an impact from aircraft.
That's right. Here you're talking about Leslie Robertson and John Skilling, who were the chief engineers of the World Trade Center. And they have both said, as you said, that the buildings were designed to sustain not one, but two collisions from a Boeing 707, the largest commercial aircraft at the time that the structures were built in 1971. So, but here now we're going to a third party that says it couldn't have happened. And I'm being very, very clear here in my approach is that I don't want to necessarily offer up a counter argument that relies on the third party. We're just going to go directly with what we can see and what we were told by the institutions that are telling us what to believe. So, what I would like to now say here is let's bring in our imagination. Okay. And what I'm going to ask your audience to do here is that if the building looks like it's falling down to you, use your imagination and think about how a building that was being blown up from the top down would look like. This is an exercise in expanding your imagination. And I want to be very clear here. This is not necessarily an easy thing to do because we don't have a lot of experience to rely upon when it comes to watching a building being blown up from the top down. We all presumably are familiar with buildings that are being blown up, in Las Vegas, where you have synchronized activation of charges that typically are running up and down the building, and you see an intact building sort of crush itself using its own weight to displace the supporting structure below it. So you don't really see what's going on, but you normally see the building look like a building as it's falling. What we're seeing here, on the other hand, if you use your imagination, if you're saying that the clearly the top part of the building is not there, the building could be blown up from the top down. If it were doing that, what would it look like? I suggest it would look exactly like what we just saw.
Yeah.
You would see like the top of the building just exploding in a mushroomy like cloud, sending debris everywhere. If that's what's happening, we would have to concede that the explosives that were being used would have been highly energetic because you're not necessarily displacing the building slightly off kilter and letting gravity pull it down. You are destroying the building floor by floor. So we would expect then to see debris, let's say, that's being hurled laterally a long way. And that is, in fact, exactly what happened. So we have now corroborating physical evidence that would support the idea that it's being blown up. Just putting it out there. I'm trying to be extremely scientific as we step through this information. Now is number 4, familiarize yourself with the relevant scientific principles. So as opposed to our friends at the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association that say, go to the fact checkers, you have to do your own legwork. You have to understand something about the laws of motion or gravity and how things reliably move when subjected to forces. So I just define scientific principles as axioms that all sides would agree are true. And some of the basic things that I'd like to bring up here are Newton's laws of motion, which define how the physical world reliably behaves at the gross level. And specifically, I'm referring to the third law of motion, which is commonly paraphrased as for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. But putting this into simpler terms, imagine crushing a brick into dust with a heavy axe. You can do it, right? You just keep crushing and hitting it, and it's going to turn to dust eventually. But what if the axe itself was made of brick? That means, according to Newton, and test this in your own imagination or go out and try it yourself. If you strike a brick with another brick hard enough to crush the brick, the thing that you're using to strike it must also get crushed.
Yes.
There's no avoiding that. It doesn't matter which element is moving and which is static, the force of collision is going to cause both to break. And so, as it applies to this system, if the top of the building is applying enough force to the bottom to pulverize it as it falls, the top has to get crushed too, because both parts are made of the same stuff, right? And moreover, the top part is not designed as heavily as the bottom part because they did not use the same thickness of beam in the top part because the top part didn't have to carry the weight of the top part. The bottom part did. So it's even more absurd to think that the top part could somehow crush the bottom part. That would be impossible.
Well, that's why your spine is much bigger at L5 than it is at C1 and C2.
Yeah, that's the way we build things. I mean, in the tower, you can't tell the bottom part is not thicker than the top part. It's a very beautiful and iconic structure, obviously, but as it's designed internally, the infrastructure, if you will, the skeleton of the building is, in fact, thicker in the bottom. Just like, you look at someone's physical form, you can't tell that their lumbar spine is more sturdily put together than their cervical spine, but that's how you build a building. There's no reason to make the top part of the building able to hold 100,000 tons of building over it. That would be inefficient. Okay, so this is the difficult question, and this is the question that I approached this problem with as I looked at this for the very first time in 2017, is how did our authorities somehow reconcile what happened with the third law of motion? How could they possibly explain how the top part could crush the bottom part? Where do you go? This is where you must look at the source documents yourself. Don't listen to popular mechanics. Don't listen to your buddy who does contract work around the neighborhood. What did NIST say? And NIST outlines their full investigation in a number of papers, but their final report, which is called NC Star 1, Final Report on the Collapse of the World Trade Center Towers, was published in December of 2005. Go there and then ask yourself, how is the central question answered? And this is what's so astonishing. The downward movement of this structural block, and by structural block, we're talking about the top part of the building, was more than the damaged structure could resist, and global collapse began. What's wrong with this statement? What's wrong with it is that they're not telling you how it happened. That was one of your big points. Why and how? And they just simply say that that's what happened. And because it's the National Institute for Standards and Technology, we walk away from it and say, oh, I think they explained it, but they actually didn't. They just state that that's what happened. This is not an investigation. They're just telling you what happened, but they don't tell us why. And if that isn't obviously clear that that's what they're doing, they explicitly say it's the segment E3 of NC Star 1, summary of findings. This is from the executive summary. And they say in a little footnote, their analysis includes little analysis of the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached and collapse became inevitable. What does this mean? This means that they didn't do an analysis. They didn't even look at how this could have happened or why this could have happened. If you go through the thousands of pages of technical explanation, nowhere will you find in this explanation any mention of how much the top of the building weighed. How much do those 14 stories weigh? Don't you think this is a central parameter in coming up with a sequence of collapse? They don't even look at it.
You can't do the physics without that information.
We can't do the physics. Nowhere do they mention the strength of the steel or how fast the collapse sequence should have transpired. There is nothing, and the reason why there's nothing is that they're explicitly telling you we're not going to look at that. But that was the central question. So the central question was not answered. This should be mind-blowing to people who think that, oh, it's all been described and answered by the best applied mathematicians that we have. No, they explicitly tell you that they're not going to give you the explanation.
One of the basic principles of magic is that you get people to look where you want them to look, so they don't see what you're doing with your other hand.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, the trick creates the illusion, but the illusion wouldn't be an illusion if you were actually watching the other hand. So sometimes so-called factual information is the redirect, so you won't look at what the other hand is doing, which is, I think, the whole story of 911 as it relates to what we're talking about with the issues in the world today. It's an example of the magic being done in the public.
I mean, it's the same thing as, lawyers exchanging information. And instead of giving you the relevant stuff, they give you everything. So now you've got to spend, thousands of hours poring over documents to find out what you need.
Yeah.
It's all here. And regardless, so, I'm hoping there are naysayers in your audience who are still skeptical of what we're presenting here. I hope at the very least, this was eye-opening to show you explicitly that they did not answer the question that they were tasked to answer. And that right there is a misconception that the public has. To summarize, this is how the US government answered the central questions. Why did the Twin Towers fall? Answer, because they were hit by planes. How can we know that there wasn't another mechanism in play? Well, it's because after the planes hit, the building fell. That is what they told you. That's what the $20 million that was given to this commission did. That's all they said. And by telling us that they didn't do an investigation, but claiming that they explained what happened, they're essentially implicating themselves as a complicit party in a cover-up. It would be different if they just, said, well, we're not going to, if the mainstream media said, well, we don't have an explanation. Basically, we were being told that an investigation was done, but they didn't do one.
We hope you are enjoying today's show, where Paul is giving you an extended episode and a taste of the great content available to Spirit Gym podcast members. Membership includes access to exclusive long-form episodes of Spirit Gym with Paul Chek, where he dives deeper into discussions with his guests, access to the podcast members forum within the Spirit Gym community, where you can interact with other passionate listeners, Q&A opportunities with Paul, and the chance to purchase exclusive Spirit Gym merchandise. Your support helps keep the show running and allows Paul to bring you interesting guests and even better content. So if you're ready to dive deeper and unlock all these amazing extras, head over to paulchek.com/podcast and become a Spirit Gym podcast member today. Paul's regular weekly show still continues to be available to everyone on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, and YouTube.
Well, what thought came to my mind, it's amazing that we can put rockets, on the moon, or, launch satellites and have them land exactly where we want to, but somehow we can't do the physics on something that killed thousands of people and was, worthy of investigation and worthy of public awareness.
Correct. Let me also be very clear here. I hope we can see that things are getting fishy for people who haven't looked at this, and who's capable of doing these things. We're going to get into this later, I think, when we talk about the implications. But notice that the investigatory authority on this is part of the U.S. government directly. So if the U.S. government was involved somehow, either subtly, peripherally, or centrally in this deception, there's now a conflict of interest because the government itself is conducting the investigation into the event.
That's the drug manufacturer doing their own research on the drug they're trying to get approved, which is completely ridiculous. And that's exactly what the FDA and all these organizations allow, which has always baffled my mind from the first day I read that. I about fell out of my chair. I'm like, this is like totally a date with the devil right here.
That's right. We're going to, put together an investigatory committee to investigate ourselves, and you can trust us because we're going to,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's like the Catholic Church investigating pedophilia,
Yeah. All right. So now we're getting at the next step. Assess the initial coverage of the event. This is really, really important. And I wanted to paraphrase this with this, which is that I don't believe that all the journalists and legacy media are in cahoots to mislead the public. They're following their editors' directives. Directives from the very top take time for them to take effect in terms of the reporting. This is why initial coverage is really, really important. But the public is completely unaware that dozens of mainstream media platforms were all reporting massive explosions in the Twin Towers well after the plane struck, largely when the buildings were falling down. And this is a montage of mainstream media that morning.
But as I was looking up, I saw the entire explosion. It looked exactly like the first two, but we certainly had the most perfect vantage point for that explosion. It was unbelievable. And
there has just been a huge explosion. We can see a billowing smoke rising, and I'll tell you that I can't see that second tower.
The two towers, a huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us.
We're not sure exactly what happened, but it was another explosion on the far side of one of the buildings from where we're standing. The reverberation and another explosion on the right-hand side.
Watch the right side. Exploding.
On the far side of the building, there seemed to be another explosion, and also on the right-hand side, there was also another explosion. We're not sure if that was extra reverberation from what happened at the World Trade Center, or if that was an added explosion.
We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
Again, there has been a second explosion here in Manhattan at the Trade Center.
And believe it or not, there was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it, came down, sending smoke and debris everywhere.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
A huge explosion, a huge rumbling cloud. We're taking photographs and securing this area just prior to that huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
But it literally exploded and came down as though it had been hit.
We heard an explosion.
That explosion happened was shooting pieces of the plane. There are pieces of the plane on Church Street.
There's another explosion as we speak.
Something either exploded or fell off the side of the one building that was attacked.
Then the entire top of the building just blew up.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
It was just a small explosion, and then rocks and debris and everything started pouring down.
We were about 2 blocks away when the second explosion hit, and all we heard was just this small explosion. Then you saw a roar of an explosion and all kinds of smoke billowing out, debris falling down.
It's unbelievable because you hear these explosions. In fact, I just heard another one. I don't know if it was like an after effect or whatnot, just while you were on the phone talking about the school closings. I'm hearing another explosion, just so you know. I'm hearing another rumble. What you can feel when these tremors come is that it literally comes up under your feet. That's what it feels like. That's the best way I know to describe it.
And this goes on. So just for your audience, this is a montage put together by my friends at IC 9/11 Justice, and it refers to all of the mainstream media coverage that morning early. And 21 of those clips were eyewitness accounts in real time, and there are 15 that were narrative reports, meaning people were told that they heard explosions and it was being reported. But my point here is that you saw there were Fox News, CNN, everybody was saying the same thing. There were explosions during the collapse sequence or right before it as the buildings were coming down. That is uncontested. We also have a compilation of oral testimony that was compiled by the New York Times from first responders, 156 people, and 118 of them were New York City Fire Department firefighters that all said, unprompted, that there were explosions. They either saw, felt, or heard them. But then, less than 24 hours later, there were no more mention of explosions. And instead, the public was given the narrative, i.e. the story that we're being asked to believe. So that was the initial coverage. And now the next step is compare it to what is the narrative that we're being asked to believe. And that narrative came out less than 24 hours later. And this is something very interesting that not a whole lot of people get to see, but then this is a picture of page A3 of the late edition of the New York Times, published on September 12th, 2001. What's fascinating here is the top of the of page A3 is a very, very large, highly emotive picture of a New York policeman looking up at this carnage with a bunch of firefighters. And then below it is an article that reads, "Towers believed to be safe proved vulnerable to an intense jet fuel fire, experts say." So, what to make of this? Well, first of all, in that article is a highly detailed cutaway of the Twin Towers. It accurately demonstrates the layout of the 281 columns, 47 central columns, 244 peripheral columns, showing you how one floor of the building is constructed. Pretty amazing journalism work the day after. And in that lower cutaway, we see a sort of a stick figure of what we all saw. This is almost exactly what the clip sequence we saw in the beginning of the North Tower coming down. You see the building going down with a big mushroomy cloud. And this is what's fascinating is now they're saying, oh yeah, it's completely explainable. We saw this, and here's what happened. We know exactly what happened, and then you get wowed by the sophistication of the graphics. And they will say, in summary, after the plane struck, thousands of gallons of fuel burned. Thick layers of insulation on exterior and interior steel columns were breached, and sprinkler systems were disabled. Fires broke out with temperatures reaching perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The steel column systems softened in the heat, separated from each other, and buckled. And weighted down by debris, furniture and concrete and steel floors progressively collapsed. So, what is wrong with this? Well, I would suggest, first of all, how did they know all of this the next day? How did they know what the temperatures in the building were? That's a pretty significantly high temperature for an office fire or even jet fuel to be burning. And, I don't want to get into how hot does fuel burn, but it's 2,000 degrees is definitely a stretch. How did they know that insulation had been removed and breached? And how do they know that this was the cause of the collapse? We don't know. Where were the experts? Who were the experts? How could the experts who are willing to get quoted in the New York Times know all of this? To me, this is the beginning of a psychological operation, a psyop. We're being told what the story is, and we're in this place of incredible vulnerability. Our nation is under attack. Nothing seems to be making sense, and we are being fed the story that we must believe. It was absolutely, as these experts say, inevitable that both buildings would have fallen in that manner.
And of course, it was terrorists that did all this too. That's another.
Yes, that is what's coming up here.
Yeah, good.
Before we go there, highlighted in the article that says that the towers were proved to be vulnerable by intense jet fuel fire. The expert statement that's being highlighted is, quote, "No structure could have sustained this kind of assault," says one expert. So that's quite a statement. But right away, you see the distortion. There's telling you, with absolute certainty, nothing could have sustained this kind of assault. And that is not scientific, and neither should this be considered the end all on what happened. If it took the NIST 3 years to come up with an explanation, how could this expert know that the next day what happened? There's a technique in hypnosis called anchoring. You offer something that's undeniably true and then offer a suggestion. You sort of superimpose the reality of the true statement so that the suggestion now takes on more validity in your subconscious mind. And that's not so different from what we're seeing here, right? They're showing us the emotive photograph, unbelievable, the Twin Towers are gone, and then we're given the explanation. And so we reify that explanation. And, again, I'm not saying that that was done intentionally, but I can see how that would work. Here's the next question I want to ask you, which is the biggest mystery, which is, where did the buildings go? How could a 10-story building filled with HVAC equipment, furniture, backup generators, plumbing, and 110 acre-sized concrete slabs end up in a pile that was at most, say, 7 stories high? Because there was 6 stories underground, and there was only about 1.5 stories of debris. And this is the central question that was being asked by Governor George Pataki, who was giving a tour to a CNN reporter just a couple of days later. And Pataki makes some very bold and asks some very bold questions and statements. And after commenting that it looked like a nuclear bomb went off in the buildings, interestingly, he then says, first, there's very little concrete left. The concrete was pulverized. Lower Manhattan is covered with a blanket of concrete dust 3 inches thick. The surrounding buildings, though damaged, are structurally intact. And the majority of first responder deaths occurred during the collapse of the 2 towers. So I've linked up the video here, and I don't know if you really want to show it or not. Your readers can go to it if you want to. But Pataki essentially says that. And what I want to bring your attention to is the fact that the first responders died. There was an enormous amount of fatalities in the fire department. Why? Because they rushed into the building. They knew that the building was not going to come down, because steel structures don't come down from fires. And so for someone to second guess their judgment, I think is it's a lot of hubris, because these people are very brave and very courageous.
And they're very well trained. I mean, they know the architecture. I mean, they know this stuff inside and out. I've rehabilitated multiple fire captains, and the level of training they have to do is extensive.
So as I'm saying, yeah, they're courageous, but they won't go into a building that's unstable. So why did they all rush into the buildings? They were completely taken aback by the fact that this steel structure not only failed, it failed catastrophically. And it didn't happen once, it happened twice. And as we'll see with Building 7, 3 structures came down unpredictably, or so we think. All right. Identify a better alternative explanation. And this is where I'd like to introduce the controlled demolition theory. So, to be very, very clear, NIST's explanation is what's called a hypothesis. It's a possible explanation, but it has no supporting evidence. There is no evidence that plane collisions and fires were the only cause of the tower's demise. And their hypothesis violates a law of motion. If they were being scientific, they would have looked for another mechanism of destruction, and they didn't do it. So although we can't be 100% certain of what brought the buildings down, we can be 100% certain, given the laws of motion, that it wasn't just the planes. So the question is, why didn't the engineers at NIST not look for evidence of the most likely explanation, which is controlled demolition, or the placement of highly energetic incendiary charges that could be detonated synchronously? They say in their executive summary that they found no corroborating evidence for controlled demolition. And when they were pressed in their press conferences afterwards, they admitted that they didn't look for any, citing the fact that there were no reports of explosions taking place prior to the collapse sequence. But we just saw, right? We just saw
over and over again.
Yes. So they're lying, or they're being unbelievably
naive,
or complicit, or unthorough, let's say,
or following the chain of command.
Yeah, right.
I'm an ex-paratrooper. I know about the chain of command, and it's do not ask questions. Information comes on a need-to-know basis.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly why I didn't want to be a paratrooper. golden rule is I can't kill somebody unless I know for sure that they are guilty of what they're being charged for. And if you cannot ask questions, and you're going to be going out and killing people and taking over entire territories and potentially wiping out countless numbers of families and children and women, like I'm not built out of that level of ignorance and stupidity. I just can't do it. Hi, everybody. You know, apple cider vinegar is like a panacea that's been shown through all sorts of research to help with just about anything. And I personally love the stuff. I found it very, very beneficial on many levels. And Paleo Valley's apple cider vinegar complex is absolutely awesome. And I've got Autumn Smith, their founder, here right now to tell you why it will be a great addition to your life. Autumn, what is it about your cider vinegar complex that we should all know about?
Well, I created the apple cider vinegar complex because I was on a mission to not only live as long as possible, but to feel amazing when I did that. And I learned about apple cider vinegar's incredible ability to help keep our blood sugar very nice and stable, which is one thing we know people who live long, healthy lives have. And then I added organic cinnamon and organic ginger and organic turmeric, all that have different benefits of their own, from anti-inflammatory properties to brain benefits. And we put them all into capsules so that you could take it and then have your digestion feel better. You could have more energy. You could avoid the ups and downs all day long because you have that nice stable blood sugar. And of course, another interesting side is that apple cider vinegar may actually be able to help your body break down glyphosate. So there are so many different ways that you can use this product and reasons that you might. And the reason it's so important to me is because I want food to be used as medicine. And so we can encourage our bodies to do all of these amazing things simply by the addition of the apple cider vinegar complex.
Well, I also love that you have ginger in there because it's a very effective anti-parasitic. And today, with the amount of processed food people are eating, it's a really good idea to have some ginger in your diet.
Go to paleovalley.com/Chek15 and save 15% on your purchase. No promo code is required. That's paleovalley.com/CHEK15.
This is very important because, as we're in this world of, CGI and post-processing, and you can create any image you want to and any video that you want to, which is why it's really important to listen with your own ears of people who were witness to explosions. Like, what did they sound like? Did these people sound like they're lying?
We were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway. There was a heavy-duty explosion
inside the lobby.
We stuck on the stairs for a while. We finally got down to the lobby. Then we get to the lobby, it was this big explosion.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was those secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
It sounded like gunfire, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
The witnesses we heard, are they being equivocal, like it might have been, or, it could have been anything? They are telling you that they heard explosions going off sequentially in floors as the buildings were coming down. And it doesn't matter, honestly, if there were people there that didn't hear them. That's not where we're going. We're saying that people heard them, and they're sure that that's what happened. So it's unbelievable that NIST would say, well, we don't have to look for evidence of explosive residues on the material that we have because nobody heard any explosions. That is just, it's a frank lie.
Well, the other thing, too, is a bunch of the guys in the beginning of that clip were firemen that were standing right there.
Right. And, we're giving them credit for being heroes, but when they say what they heard, it's no longer admissible because it's uncomfortable. So that's why it's, I think, very important to listen to people with their own words and not somebody who is giving you the transcript of what's being said. So what I'd like to show your audience next is a very interesting map. And this is a map of where human remains were found with respect to ground zero. And this was initially published in the Village Voice several years after 9/11, when a Muslim group wanted to erect a mosque in Lower Manhattan, and they faced some resistance because people have this idea that it was due to Islamic terrorists, and they proposed that the mosque could be nowhere inside the perimeter where dead people remains were found. And what's remarkable here is all of those red dots is where remains of human remains were found. And the furthest is over 1,100 feet away from ground zero. That's over a fifth of a mile. So, and these are bone fragments. So the point here is that these bodies, sadly, were expelled laterally a great distance from what should have been the collapse of a building or buildings.
What should have been a crush injury.
Oh my goodness. Yes, that is the next point, right? And you know the body better than anybody on this planet.
Well, not quite, but at least in the top 1%.
It's probably more than that, Paul. Come on, The point here is that, the human body is fragile. We know that, but it's one thing to sustain an injury from a crush injury, which you would expect, and another thing to be blown into pieces. In fact, one body that the medical examiner in New York City found was blown into 200 pieces. 200 pieces. Now, this is not the kind of injuries you would expect from, like you said, from a collapse, from crush injuries.
Or a fire.
Or a fire.
Gasoline, air, jet fuel, or otherwise. It would have just been ash.
Correct. Look, and we cannot be confused with the idea that, well, these were very heavy buildings and that could have happened. The reality is, in order to blow a human body into hundreds of pieces, there has to be an enormous amount of energy density involved. You see what I'm saying? In order to impart that kind of energy to a body, it has to be extremely concentrated. You're only going to see this from an explosive event. There's no getting around that. Now, this is a very, very interesting clip, and this is one of the last things I'm going to say about the Twin Towers. And this harkens back to why mainstream media stopped showing the collapse of the buildings. And this is a remarkable piece of commentary from David Chandler, who is part of the International Center for 9/11 Justice. And this is something he put together years ago, and one of the most remarkable pieces of evidence for a controlled demolition. And what he's going to show you here is the North Tower coming down, and he is going to show you what the trained eye can see.
The starting point in science is observation. What you are seeing here is what happened to the North Tower of the World Trade Center, the second of 3 buildings to collapse on 9/11/2001. I use the word collapse, but words can be deceptive. What do you really see happening here? There's a tremendous amount of falling debris, but under the canopy of debris, do you see the rapid sequence of explosive ejections of material? Some of the jets have been clocked at over 100 miles per hour. I will call them explosions because it's hard to find other words that describe what we are seeing here. The explosions are not isolated and few. They are continuous and widespread. They move progressively down the faces of the building, keeping pace with the falling debris. Perhaps you can imagine a natural cause, but I can't. Notice that the explosions are occurring on multiple floors at once, over a wide zone, not in a floor-by-floor sequence that might be explained by pancaking collapse. Notice there are explosions far below the point of collapse. Some are isolated and focused. These are often referred to as squibs and are commonly seen in controlled demolitions. However, this is not a standard controlled demolition. The building is being progressively destroyed from the top down by waves of explosions, creating a huge debris field. The destruction is in waves, not just in one wave. Most obvious is a rapid sequence of explosions near the visible corner of the building. But simultaneously we can see another wave of explosions much further down the face of the building under the canopy of falling debris. Notice that both waves of explosions progressed down the face of the building, nearly keeping pace with the falling debris just a few feet away. Slabs of concrete did not fall to the ground and smash to dust. There is almost no concrete in the rubble pile. Notice that the concrete is being forcefully ejected outward from the sides of the building, already pulverized to dust. Notice that embedded in the dust clouds are huge girders and entire sections of steel framing that are being hurled out of the building. The horizontal speed of some of the girders has been clocked at over 70 miles per hour. Some of these girders impale themselves in the sides of neighboring buildings. Some landed as much as 2 football fields away from the base of the tower. What could hurl heavy girders with such force and give them such speed?
Look, some people still look at that and say, "Oh, well, it's falling down from a gravitational collapse." But that to me looks like it's being blown up floor by floor in a very, very quick way. In fact, those buildings fell at about 65% of the rate of gravity, which means it was accelerating towards the ground, which also means the bottom 20 floors went apart in a second. 20 floors being, crushed in a second.
I'm kind of fortunate because I worked in logging camps when I was younger, and I was what's called a right-of-way faller, which means I'm the one of the few brave fallers, which is the guys that cut the trees down, that go into logging camps before they're built. And the engineers have been in and they've ribboned out all the roads and all the areas where buildings are going to be built. And so I'm in an absolute jungle of trees. So right-of-way fallers are considered to be the crazy ones because you have to fall trees between trees, unlike clear-cut fallers who are on the side of a mountain just dropping one tree after another into an open space.
Yeah.
So I literally have to fall trees between trees. But the point I'm making is I was there with all the blasting crews because they were the ones that after we got the logs out where the roads would be, would have to blast through like rock faces where the only way we could build a road to save money was to go right through the side of a mountain. And so I've actually sat there and watched for hours and talked to blasters and watched how they drill the holes and watch how they stage the demolitions and literally seen sides of mountains come down and so I've actually been around high explosives and seen how they stage all this stuff. So when I'm looking at this, I've got all this memory of actually being right in the thick of it and watching them do the whole job from the ground up. So I can actually put my common sense to what I've observed and watch this whole thing going on and say, that looks terribly a lot like I used to see the way the sides of an entire mountain would come down.
Well, you're right. Sadly, not everybody has that same experience, but, hopefully we can get to the sense-making part of our left brain here and realize that it's not supposed to look like that if it's coming, just falling down. I know that we're moving along here, but this is perhaps, I would say, the most damning part of NIST's explanation. And if there was a time where, if you want to say a deep state where it tipped its hand, it has to do with Building 7. It is the clip that changed my life. It was brought to me by my wife 7 years ago, and she just casually showed me this video. It's what's called World Trade Center 7. It's the third skyscraper that went down on 9/11, and it didn't go down in the morning. It went down at 5:20 p.m., and it was not hit by a plane. And this is a very large building, even though it looks dwarfed by the Twin Towers. I saw that. I thought it was a building in Las Vegas. And when my wife told me that, no, this was Building 7 in Manhattan, this is part of the World Trade Center complex, my stomach dropped. And, I spent 2 weeks looking at the official explanation and talking to my friends who are mechanical engineers and PhDs in engineering, saying, we got to talk about this, guys. This is crazy what we're seeing right now. And as soon as they realized that I was seriously questioning the official narrative, their entire left brain just shut down. They're like, oh, well, what you're saying means that they're wrong. And of course, you can't be right because you're an anesthesiologist with an engineering degree, and therefore, let's not talk about it anymore. So what's fascinating here is that I went right to NC Star 1A, the final report on the collapse of Building 7. Building 7 is the Solomon Brothers building, and it was 47 stories tall, making it, about 550 feet high, which is a very tall building. I believe it's about 400 feet wide, and it is a large building in terms of floor space. And it went down like that. So the question is, what did NIST have to say about this building? The first thing I'll say, I'll go right to the crux, which is they said that there was an event called thermal expansion, and what they're really saying is that a column became unseated from a beam on one floor, the 12th or 13th floor, and that led to the reduction of lateral support from adjoining columns, and that led to what we just saw. So, how do they prove this theory or this hypothesis? Well, they did what you'd expect them to do, which is to build a model, a computer model. And they offered this model 7 years later. Let's show the audience what their model did. That's all they show you. Now they're going to show you the rear, what it looked like from the rear. And I want to make note to your audio listeners, there's a crumpling of one side surrounding the reported failure. So when you're using a model to support your hypothesis, the model should look like what we saw.
I was just going to say, it doesn't look anything like what we saw in the video.
Nothing like what we saw in the video, but NIST had the audacity to say, "Oh yeah, it was close enough, close enough." So we're being left to say, but it didn't look like it. But what's interesting here is that years later, an independent investigation from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, their civil engineering department, reconstructed the NIST computer model. And I'm not sure if I misspoke or not, but my point here is that when their model didn't look like what we observed, their hypothesis is wrong. Not their model, their hypothesis is wrong. So he reconstructed the NIST computer model and verified that when NIST's hypothesis was placed into his model, it looked exactly like what NIST says. But instead of stopping there, he asked the question that NIST should have asked, which is, what can we do to the model so that it looks like what we saw? What is the minimum number of columns that need to fail in order to make the model look like what we observed? And before telling you how many columns needed to be destroyed, let's see what his model looked like when he tried to make the model look like what we observed. Now, the question is, does this look like what we saw or not?
Yes.
Exactly like what we saw. That means his hypothesis is the correct one. That's not a collapse from thermal expansion due to fires. There's only one way to make that happen, because not only did they all fail, they failed synchronously, with the internal columns failing completely before the external columns. That's why we saw the penthouse part fall first, and then a few seconds later, the whole building comes down. He has effectively proven to the world that this was not due to thermal expansion. This was due to the only way we know, at least commonly know, which is controlled demolition. There is no escaping that. That building was blown up for sure. That's what the investigation should have shown, but NIST remarkably said, no, we already figured it out. Lastly, what's interesting is that the final report on Building 7 did not come out until the fall of 2007, because, as NIST admitted, they were having a very, very difficult time trying to understand what happened. Not surprisingly, because they didn't look at a controlled demolition hypothesis. They just looked at, thermal expansions. What's fascinating here is that it was widely broadcast that day that Building 7 was going to come down that afternoon. Unprecedented. What did someone know that day that NIST took 7 years to figure out.
The deputy chief of the New York Fire Department that day remembers the scene.
Well, we had our special operations people set up surveying instruments to monitor and see if there was any movement in the building. We were concerned of the possibility of collapse of the building. And we had a discussion with one particular engineer there, and we asked him if we allowed it to burn, could we anticipate a collapse, and if so, how soon? And it turned out that he was pretty much right on the money, that he said in his current state you have about 5 hours.
Someone on the ground told the fire department of New York City that the building was going to come down, and he was right on the money. He predicted the complete and total collapse of a steel structure from fires, apparently, and a complete destruction. Why didn't NIST ask whoever this genius engineer was how he knew or she knew what was going to happen? I'm through with the evidence, and thank you for allowing me to step your audience through all of that, because I think it's important to be completely informed about the science and how we approach a problem like this.
Hi, everybody. You know, gluten-containing grains are some of the most problematic foods for anybody to eat. There's entire books like Grain Brain written on what happens when we eat gluten. And a lot of these gluten-containing grains really mess up our digestion, our metabolism. They cause all sorts of skin problems, gas and bloating. And I have found in my clinical practice, very few people that are gluten intolerant can enjoy gluten-free treats at all without having the same reaction. But Wade Lightheart, co-founder of Bioptimizers, turned me on to his Gluten Guardian product, and I was amazed that I could actually enjoy an occasional brownie or cookie. And if I take a couple Gluten Guardian enzymes, I actually feel fantastic. I don't get swelling, gas, bloating, and it's such a joy to have a little freedom to enjoy a treat, right? You know, when you really live a healthy lifestyle, it can get a little confining with all the limitations we have today with all the food problems. So when you have a product like that opens the door to a little freedom, it's actually quite a gift. So Wade, could you tell us how Gluten Guardian does its magic?
Well, gluten is like the cover of a baseball, and that cover is this protein coating that we can't unlock the nutrients inside it. And it turns out that researchers at Harvard found that gluten is inflammatory for everyone, even if you can't feel it.
Yes.
However, there is a specific enzyme that will actually break down that protein coating which the gluten molecule contains. It's called DPP4, dipeptidyl peptidase 4. That's a tongue twister. But the bottom line is we have the highest dosage of DP4 that you can get without a prescription, and it is absolute magic. You can enjoy pizza, bread, pasta, cookies, all that. Not that we're recommending that, but of course, when you go to a restaurant, sometimes the food is contaminated, even if you're so, stringent on your diet. And the bottom line is Gluten Guardian serves as a guardian for your health, your diet, and the inflammatory conditions that arise from eating gluten.
So if you say you eat a couple of cookies or a brownie and you take a couple of Gluten Guardian enzymes, but you still feel some symptoms, what's the range for how many of those capsules you can take without giving yourself any kind of trouble? Is there any kind of ceiling on that?
It's going to vary from person to person. Now, I would rate people on a scale of 1 to 10 on how sensitive, and that usually increases as we age. So what we suggest people is start with 1 to 2 capsules and then increase the dosage until you feel no symptoms. And then once you're there, what we found, usually after 3-4 months of that, you can start to use less and less of the Gluten Guardian. It seems to have a systemic effect on the body.
Excellent. So how do people get a hold of this amazing product, Gluten Guardian?
Super simple. Just go to www.bioptimizers.com/living4D. Put in Paul10 for a 10% discount. That's BIOPTIMIZERS.com/living4D. Paul 10 will get you a discount on this and all of our other products.
And while you're there, shop around, because every single one of the products made by Bioptimizers is the highest quality with the most advanced science. I've tested them all. I use them all. I love them, or I wouldn't be sharing them with you here. Thank you, Wade.
Thank you.
This exercise is really an exercise in critical thinking, right? It's an exercise in effective problem solving. It is the who, what, where, why, when, and how, and so why this is important to me. And even though 911 seemed very outdated to people, the reason I wanted to have you on the podcast to go through this is because I think you and I and everybody listening, if you're smart enough to follow a podcast like this and be a regular listener, then you already know that the show that we have been dealing with for the last 4.5 years has not ended by any means, and that we need to start applying these critical thinking skills on a mass scale publicly, because ultimately, if we don't, then, more and more debris will continue to fly in the mystery of collapse, so to speak. And yet how far down the rabbit hole do you finally get before you pull your head out of your fourth point of contact and say, wait a minute, if I would have just paid attention, I might have made some decisions for my family and myself and my friends and everybody that I love that could save lives. And I think, most people that are smart enough to get a driver's license at this point should see enough evidence to say, we've really got to collectively decide what it means to be an American, and what it means to have a constitution, and what it means to actually, what is a government, and what does it mean to be democratic, and what does it mean for the people, by the people, and all these things that, I don't honestly know what most people are doing every day, but it shocks me to this very day how many people I run into that don't think about this. And I might have mentioned it to you in the past, but I was having a chat with my buddy Kyle Kingsbury, and he said, Paul, well, I've come up with the perfect formula to determine who I can and cannot talk truth to. I said, what's that? He said, I asked them, what do you think really happened with 911?
Thank you, Kyle. Yes. Keep going, Paul.
And he says, if they say it was a terrorist attack, then I know I have to completely just ignore the real issues, because they probably got a mask in their pocket and they're about to don it, and, the blah, blah, blah. And I thought, that is such the perfect litmus test. I mean, that's far better than the PCR test, because it actually works.
That is so appropriate. And in fact, I had it in my notes to bring that up. That is exactly the way I approach it. When I talk to anybody that I don't know and we're starting to get into the nitty gritty, that's the first question I ask them is, what do you think happened on 9/11? Because there's no point in going any further if they believe the conventional story. We have to talk about, I don't know, Netflix or something.
Yeah. Well, if we're going to talk about Netflix, start with The Social Dilemma, because that tells you a part of the story that is the reason so many people are caught in this false belief, false narrative, and don't ask questions and believe instead of thinking, and are too busy playing video games and eating poisonous junk food to actually think, while they're slowly killing themselves and paying for it,
Mm-hmm.
So, what I want to do to wrap it all up is, please feel free to say in your own words. Look, I think it's important to reiterate here. We are talking to Madhava Setty, MD, with a degree in engineering and a background in engineering, and he's got all the knowledge of an MD, and he's got many, many years of experience, and he's got a background in engineering. These are honest investigations by a man that has a real interest in truth and human beings and well-being and the planet and things that matter. So, this exercise really, to put the rubber to the road, now we got to bring it full circle. And so, Madhava, I'm tasking you with, why is what you've just shared very relevant to the issues of right, NOW, right now?
Despite your gracious description of my background, I'm not asking anyone to trust me. This was an exercise in sense making, which offers incredible fruits, especially when applied to an event like 9/11, because 9/11 is, like, as we said, a litmus test for your understanding of the world. And it's also something that can be seen readily. You don't have to have a background in epidemiology, virology, or applied mathematics. look at the world? Do you believe that those things could have happened with those kinds of witnesses and that kind of investigation? Do you believe that it was sound? And it brings us to a very difficult place, because where it brings us, to answer your question, is I don't pretend to know who is responsible for this. Whoever was controls the media. This could have never flown if the media actually reported what happened, and if the media asked our authorities, how do you explain all the things that I just brought to you over the last hour and a half? None of those questions were ever asked by the media, and the media will legitimize whatever voice or whatever narrative you want to give them. And so that, I would say, is the primary takeaway from this, is notice how dirty these people are. And I'm not saying that whenever they say something, they're wrong. If they're telling you that a hurricane is going to hit, I would say believe them. They know more about it than I do. But when it comes to geopolitical events of this size, be aware of the fact that they're being controlled. And we have to be able to access something beyond our own knowledge here. We have to get into what I like to call intuition. And the only way to get there, honestly, is to first get rid of your biases, get rid of your assumed opinions about how the world works, and look at it in this potentially the sequence of analysis and deconstruction of what's being told. If you're still not sure about what to believe here, I understand that, but go look deeper. And we try to do some legwork for you to bring you the evidence that is incontrovertible. But there's much, much more out there, and eventually you will come down to a very difficult proposition, which is, where does that leave me if that's the way the world works? Unfortunately, the 9/11 Truth Movement, as well as the Health Freedom Movement, which I know you support, Paul, it's getting misconstrued as some sort of dystopian view of the world. But the reality is if we can correct the rot and get rid of it and find out what's behind this, we can construct a completely different new world with new systems.
I wanted to remind everybody that the word television means tell a vision. And that is a tool to make believe.
Yeah.
And we have this childlike, innocent faith that what we see on a television is true, because we're conditioned to believe in journalism and we're conditioned to believe in experts. But most people, unfortunately, don't realize that for as long as human beings have been on the planet, one of the things that's been the Achilles heel of humanity is the willingness to sacrifice morals, ethics, and values for money.
Yeah.
And if there's one thing COVID taught us, is that even the people we think we can trust the most are susceptible to being bought off. And a very good example of that, which I found shocking and disgusting, I just happened to come across this. It was called a roundtable meeting, and it was like a township meeting. And they were having them all over the United States during COVID. And I can't remember which news feed I got. It could have been Children's Health Defense. It could have been Green Med Info. It could have been some other obscure one that was known to be accurate for its reporting. But this was a town hall meeting. And they were discussing how they should be handling the pandemic, right? And should we be social distancing? Should we be masking? And one of the people that got up to speak was a higher up in the Christian religious organization. And he stated, did you know that the US government offered every single Christian church $5 million to close their parish during the pandemic? And
Wow.
he said something like 98% of them took the money and shut down, and he was one of the few that did not do it. And I don't remember the exact percentage, but it was really high.
Yeah.
And he then expressed his deep, deep sadness and deep disgust at how people would go completely against everything we've known about health, whether it be viruses or otherwise, and how completely against the integral concept of Christianity and supporting each other and staying together and to push people out and close the doors and accept a bribe, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And, the amount of money that went into that, I mean, I haven't even tried to do research on how many Christian churches there are in the United States alone. But this goes right back to something Manly P. Hall said in one of his lectures. You know who Manly P. Hall is?
I do.
Amazing guy. I mean, wrote God knows how many books. I must have 30 of them in my library, but there's probably 100 of them out there. But Manly P. Hall said, if you go to any third world country in the world and you want to find where the money is, go behind any Christian church and you will find a Mercedes-Benz or an expensive BMW. And on the inside, they will be counting the money Monday to Friday and trying to figure out how to get more on Sunday. And so, what's the point? The point is that there's always a game going on and there's always an organizational structure to it. And somebody is always trying to take advantage of somebody else. And unfortunately, that's an inherent human tendency. And sadly, the function of religion, if one of the key functions of religion, because this is something I've researched extensively, is to create a moral and ethical structure by which a community or a society, a large group of people can be held together, because tribes usually start breaking down after you get to about somewhere between 55 and 65 people. A small structure like that isn't enough to hold a tribe together. So once you get larger groups of people, if you don't have some kind of binding morality and binding ethical contract, which is what government is ultimately supposed to do, then everything turns into chaos and piracy, and people start ripping each other off and killing each other. And so one of the original functions of religion was to actually hold larger communities together.
That's right.
And so part of what was so shocking and to learn about that and the myriad of other things I could cite is that even the most ancient form of common bonding we have, other than the fire itself, the campfire and the hunt, which is religion, has been and is being used to co-opt people. And religion, organized religion is one of the largest for-profit businesses in the world. The Vatican's one of the richest corporations in the world. And so part of what I'm saying here is that we have to get out of the childlike mindset of believing that God's there to take care of you and everybody's trustworthy, and my pastor and my preacher and my Sunday school teacher would never rape my children. I've had no less than 50 clients personally in my client that have come to me with the trauma of being raped in a church, mostly Catholic, some Mormon, some others, but mostly Catholic. And I'm looking at this, doing the math. I'm like, I am one therapist in a world of now approximately 8 billion people. And if I have, in my career of 40 years, come across at least 50 people that were raped by the very people we have entrusted the deepest aspects of ourselves to, then what is the grand number out there of people that have had this kind of trespass? Ken Wilber says it very beautifully. He says it's time for us all to wake up, clean up, grow up, and show up. Wake up means wake up to the deeper truths of consciousness. He's speaking this from the perspective of conscious evolution. You can read this in his book, Radical Wholeness. It's fairly new. It's just come out. He cites multiple times that the average 65% of the world population is at the same level as fundamentalist religion is at, which correlates to the child archetype, being told what to do by a daddy in the sky. He says that's a very, very dangerous situation to have, because those are all ethnocentric oriented religions, which means my group against your group. And that's the number one. He says at least 3 times in the book that religious differences and battles are the number one cause of wars to this very day. And, and don't think that doesn't go right to wars we've been in for a long time. If you went back through the video footage of the Gulf War and all the wars we've had in the Middle East in the last, 15 years, or all the wars since Vietnam, you will see constant references. I remember I used to see guys on aircraft carriers writing "this one's from Jesus" on warheads that are strapped to fighter jets. Is actually a very, very low level of consciousness, and it's being used to divide us and conquer us and keep us in a state of stress, which is, the magician moving the ball to one side while the other hand's doing the magic trick. And so the wake up part means we have to wake up to higher levels of consciousness, which means you have to really engage some kind of a meditative or spiritual practice and stop reading books and memorizing stuff and really spend time with yourself, in yourself, with nature, and observe life and observe what's happening around you, and study the saints, study the mystics, study the people that evolved beyond the narrative of the dogma. And then cleanup means you have to actually go inside of yourself and look at your own judgments against yourself and others, and ask. The Steiner's approach is to ask, is it really true? And do the work. Is it really true that my mother doesn't love me? Is it really true that I can trust someone who's got an MD degree because they swore to the Hippocratic Oath? Is it really true that my government has my best interest at heart? Is it really true that my tax dollars are being used to support the infrastructure of the company, not used to destroy us? So cleaning up means you have to grow up and face reality and ask, is it really true about 911? Is it really true about the pandemic, etc.? And if you don't do the work to answer those questions, you can never become an adult. That's the problem.
Yeah.
And children are very easy to trick and manipulate. So you got wake up, clean up, grow up. It means grow up and accept responsibility for the choices that you make, and know there's consequences to choices. And to the degree that you're a parent or a teacher or a leader or a medical professional or a government professional or a policeman or a fireman or someone in public service, you have to show up and do what is morally and ethically right to do, even if it means you might lose your job. So wake up, clean up, grow up, and show up. That's what we're doing right now. We're showing up to say, hey, everybody, even if you understand all this, it's important to share any podcast that's teaching anything that's relevant to what we need to look at, and relevant to learning how to think constructively, and relevant to looking into what science really is. At one point in the beginning of the pandemic, I interviewed Ervin Laszlo. He's won many, many awards in science. He was a concert pianist. He's like 90 something years old now, but he's still going strong. And I said to him, I'm paraphrasing, but I said, as a scientist, aren't you concerned with all the stuff that's being pawned off as science, relevant to what was going on?
Yeah.
And I said, this is destroying science. And he said, Paul, I must say, this is not science. He said, what you're referring to is not scientists. They are technologists. They're people that work for large corporations that are paid, that are not doing science. They're technologists that are actually saying what they've got to say to sell technologies to you, including, this is me on the side, including PCR tests or whatever other gimmicks that they're using. And so it made a very important point, because much of what we have in mainstream media that's pawned off as science is not even coming from scientists. It's not coming from people in pursuit of the truth. A good example is if you read the book or listen to the excellent audiobook version of it, The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Furstenberg, which is all about the history of our use of electricity and all the illnesses and diseases connected to it, and too much to go into now. But Arthur Furstenberg went directly to major telecom corporations who had publicly stated scientifically based on their investigations that cell phones did not cause brain cancer.
Yep.
So he went to them and asked to see the research. Not one of them would show him the research.
Yep.
Okay, well, good. If it's science and you're publishing it in the public and you're saying that your research says this, why will you not show me the research?
Yep.
This is not science.
Correct.
And these corporations are railroading science. They are hijacking science. They are creating illusions of science. And so if there's anything that comes out of this discussion today, it's that we have to make a clear distinction between what is and isn't science, no matter what it's said. I have told people in lectures all over the world at least 1,000 times. Doesn't it concern you that every single drug that's ever had to be pulled off the market by the FDA because it was killing usually 20 to 30 or 40,000 people by they finally pulled it off was first scientifically validated and approved by the very organization taking it down? Doesn't it concern you that if you look into these drug corporations, they build in the money for the lawsuits into the profit plan in advance, already knowing and allocating sometimes billions of dollars for potential lawsuit payouts? And we're being told this is science, right? Yeah. So like these are the kinds of things people have to wake up to. The cost of being ignorant is potentially death. The cost of being ignorant today as a parent is devastating for your children. The cost of being ignorant to our environment is such a great threat that we're walking on the precipice of a potentially environmental collapse that makes COVID look like a fucking joke. The first thing that Donald Trump did when he became into the presidency was he wiped out the EPA in many different parts of the United States, shut them right down, and he then took nature preserves that were preserved to protect nature and opened them up for fracking and oil drilling. And I mean, just like crazy, crazy stuff. And the fact that the Olympics are sponsored by companies like Nestle and McDonald's, which is our greatest athletes, and they're unconscious enough to go eat that shit. I mean, I spent my whole career working with the greatest athletes in the world, and they have almost no consciousness of food. They're only now starting to wake up to it. These are the things we all have to wake up, clean up, grow up, and show up on, because the number of compounding factors at this point for humanity and for life itself is so high that if we don't start somewhere to kind of wake up, clean up, grow up, and show up, whether it be how you eat, how you feed your children, how you care for your body. For me, any road in is a road to awakening, because once you wake up to food and what's really going on with food, you wake up to corporations and what's going on with corporations. Yep. When you wake up with corporations, you wake up with regulating agencies, and that leads you to the government, and that leads you to the mafia. You just keep going. Yep. And that leads you to the World Health Organization. It leads you to the World Economic Forum. And then you realize, okay, we are actually living inside the most highly organized crime ring that's ever been conceived of. And most people don't want to actually face the truth of this. And so I personally feel responsible, to share as much as I can share with people to help them realize that this is not a time in the world to be lazy with research. It's not a time to be passive. It's not a time to be a chicken shit and worry about other people's opinions, because that's what it means to have freedom of speech. Even if I'm wrong, at least if I'm stating an opinion, it gives somebody else a chance to prove me wrong. And anybody observing learns from that. And I learn from that.
Yep.
And I think really what you did today was give us an example that nobody doesn't know about, that wasn't born, since then. I mean, and saying, okay, look, if they can pull a magic trick off like this right in front of you,
Yep.
do you actually think that's the end of their show?
Well, you said a tremendous amount there, and I would like to first say a few things and then offer your audience some hope and some strategies.
And well, one of the hopes and strategies is your book, Woke. I mean, I think that was a really great offering that you gave us to begin this wake up process. And I'm not the woke process, but the real wake up.
Exactly. Yes. Well, thank you for plugging the book. Look, some details. First of all, the Furstenberg thing with EMF. You don't, yes, they're hiding a lot of information, but if you go and look at the FCC and how they establish their own criteria for what is safe in terms of electromagnetic radiation, they will refer you to the FDA, and you go to the FDA and you look at their evidence that they put up there in public, like these are the studies that we're using, and you read those studies. Those studies, even in 3G, demonstrate that the kind of radiation that 3G phones put out is tumorigenic to rats.
Yeah.
They publicly are letting you know, and yet, we've memory hold it or not looking. So yes, a lot of it is hidden, but some of it is right out there. So you have no excuse to not know that. I loved what you said about the co-opting of religious organizations in pushing this, whatever you want to call it, this pandemic thing forward. That, like you, I was extremely disappointed. And it's not just, Christian churches. We're talking about institutes like, out by you, the Esalen Institute, over here at Kripalu, Omega. These are institutions that are supposed to bring together wisdom practices so that you can what? Well, not just, get in touch with your chakras, but apprehend what's happening out there. And they all caved. They all universally caved.
Yes. Those are supposed to be organizations for non-consensus thinkers.
Correct.
Right? Esalen is the place of the great pioneers, the Stanislav Grofs, Houston Smiths, the great pioneers of health and wellness, right? And how does an organization like that get sucked into this vacuum? And that's the difference between a professor and a journeyman.
Mm.
That's the difference between words and field experience.
Mm-hmm.
You understand my point?
Yeah.
You get universities that are co-opted that teach this truth. I mean, a great example, I got into this with Jane Buxton, and she had a lot to say about global warming. And, she wrote The Great Grain Con. I think it's called The Great Grain Con or Great Grain Fallacy. And she shows all the research showing that children that are raised on vegan diets actually have delayed brain development and actually permanent delays in disruptions in their growth and development. They don't develop normally, and it's absolutely devastatingly bad to raise kids on vegan diets.
Mm-hmm.
And she gets into the politics behind it, and then you have all this stuff with global warming and all that stuff. So you have to look into this stuff, and you got to get right down. And by the way, while it's on my mind, I really want to mention something. Danica Patrick did an interview with Greg Braden not too long ago, and he gave one of the best explanations of the global warming issues I've ever heard. And I highly recommend anyone who wants to get to the kind of the roots of this thing, listen to that interview with Greg Braden, because he shares some really important stuff about how the globalists are generating their data and how they're formulating their storyline.
Yeah.
And it's important that everybody knows that, because it goes exactly hand in hand with how the COVID pandemic came off.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, that is an enormous topic. And I've looked into that deeply myself. And, while we're on the topic, just quickly for your listeners, most people who sort of buy into the CO2 driven global warming narrative base their position on what? Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. And you go and look at that. Go find it. find it on YouTube and look at where he's showing you how temperature and CO2 have been fluctuating, right? There's some really important deceptions to look at. Does he ever address why CO2 keeps going up and down every 112,000 years or so? No, he does not. Does he show you superimposed the CO2 and temperature? He doesn't, for a very good reason, because in fact, temperature is leading CO2 every single time. CO2 is not driving temperature.
Yeah.
Temperature is driving CO2 because as temperature goes up, the solubility of CO2 in water goes down. Temperature is driving CO2. I'm not suggesting that 420 parts per million is not high. It's relatively high given our recent data, but don't buy into it just because it looks like a pretty graph and you're being spoken to by Al Gore. But that is, again, a massive deception. And I'm interested to go and look at what Greg Brayton said. Many great points. I think I hit about, the Christian church. You're right. I mean, even Yuval Harari talks about the need to bring together larger groups of individuals based on a belief system so that you could fight Homo erectus. That's his basic thesis behind Sapiens. So you have to get them to buy into a belief system. And one of the, best ways to do that, including bringing people together under, say, Roman rule at the 4th century at the Council of Nicaea, is to get people together and say, oh, yeah, this is what Christianity is. Everybody buy into it. And, that birthed the Catholic Church, if you will. And how do we know that our parishioners are following what we're telling them? Well, we're going to have confessionals every Sunday to make sure that everyone's in line. It's like, the first kind of surveillance, if you will. Wanted to throw that in there. So, Paul, as we wind down here, you asked me what can we offer your audience in terms of steps? Like we offered my approach to making sense of stuff, but I also have a very quick sort of synopsis of what we can do, especially as people who don't have a platform in this. Like, how do we actualize a transformation? And it requires a little bit of thought, a lot of work, and, a meditative and contemplative state. But if it's all right with you, I'm just going to drop down these suggestions.
Please.
I believe that in order to actualize a shift in our collective consciousness about what's really going on and how the systems on our planet work to enslave us, we have to have an awakening. And this awakening, I believe, has to come up from the ground up, not the top down. Top down control of our resources, information, and in this case, sense making will not work in a world where people have true self determination, agency, and freedom. So, if we want to reclaim our sovereignty, we have to help cultivate a different way of apprehending what is transpiring in front of us by first empowering the individual to make their own judgments. And as you mentioned before, this is why the First Amendment is first. A little bit about the First Amendment. The founding fathers of this country realized that the freedom of expression is absolutely necessary for suppressing the rise of totalitarianism, which will eventually ensue if we cannot speak freely. And the First Amendment, and this is something that is often not considered, it begins with the axiom that a population that is capable of self-governance must be able to distinguish information from misinformation and legitimate ideas from destructive ones themselves. So here we are 248 years later, and we're at a major inflection point. We're being bombarded with the idea that our government and academic institutions must be the purveyors of what's true. And we're watching the First Amendment disintegrate in front of our eyes. In other words, there's a demonstrable, in my opinion, effort to fool us into thinking that we cannot make up our own minds. We are subtly and overtly being told that smarter people need to do that for us. But the antidote, in my opinion, is not to create another ministry of truth, right? This is, I'm referring to George Orwell's 1984. So if we're interested in opposing this movement towards the control of our thinking, we have to help each other. And getting to clarity requires all of us to participate. So this is, very much like cryptocurrency and blockchain technology, in the sense that, the beauty of that is eliminating the centralized authority that determines the validity of a transaction. It's very much like eliminating the so-called arbiters of what is factual. So sense making has to emerge in as the result of a distributed effort. So my point is that we all have a role to play. And so with that, I have a few suggestions for all of us, especially, as I said, for people like most people who don't have a platform. First, remember that practically speaking, facts are subjective. Time and time again, when I ask intelligent and educated people what it would take for them to change their mind, the most common answer is, I will believe your facts when the New York Times reports them.
Oh, Jesus.
We can only be certain of what isn't, not what is. So be careful insisting that you are absolutely certain about what happened or what is playing out. Being certain is not a reason for anyone to believe you. It's much easier and productive to dismantle a false narrative than it is to prove what is. Science is, after all, the never-ending pursuit to establish what is. I don't like to use the word truth because truth implies certainty and immutability. I prefer to use the word clarity. In other words, a viewpoint that's free of bias. That is actually the best that we can do. Be aware of false narratives from our side. In order to upend the myths told by our medical institutions like the CDC, we have to convince doctors that they have been wrong. Only then will these agencies of public health surrender their sway over our public health. There's no way any doctor in the medical orthodoxy will listen to you when you begin with the idea, for example, that viruses do not exist. It may be fair to say that you haven't seen evidence strong enough to convince you that they do, but starting out averring that they don't is epistemologically unsound because you would be asserting the null hypothesis proven, which is impossible. Similarly, like with regards to 9/11, using the argument that plane wings made of aluminum could never damage steel is incorrect. If the energy of collision is great enough, both the aluminum and steel would be damaged. The obvious problem that I'm trying to bring up here is that making unsound statements leads to a wholesale rejection of all the valid points you may have. So, in my experience, I've found that well intending people on our side, the side of clarity, do as much damage to our efforts by making false claims than those of the orthodoxy who are pushing the false narrative. Here's an important point. When you're engaged with someone you disagree with on social media, you have to understand that that person is never going to concede, not publicly at least. But that's not the goal. The objective is not to convince them that they're wrong. The objective is to convince the audience who is witnessing this that you have a better argument.
Mm-hmm.
And very often the audience is not going to know who has the better argument, but they'll be open to listening to you if you comport yourself better than the other side. This is where I'm saying tone is extremely, extremely important. Know that legacy media is the primary conspirator in all large conspiracies. And this is why we must support independent media. It's really important to form networks with many nodes, not one or two large voices of truth coming from our side, because it's much easier for them to attack one or two of us who happen to be highly influential spokespersons than a distributed network, which is all loosely affiliated with each other. So we need to share content from lesser known voices. You have to know your audience. So be careful, when you're giving your spiel, for example, you don't know where the other person is coming from, and it's not always possible to know your audience. So it's best to start where there is the highest likelihood of agreement first. And as an example, I recently spoke to an old medical school classmate of mine who I didn't talk to since before the pandemic. And she's a doctor in Texas. And I assumed that she probably realized that the safe and effective measure didn't do a whole lot of good, but was unwilling to accept the fact that it was dangerous. So I started by attacking the benefits. But I was surprised to realize that in her experience, it was extremely safe and effective. And she was very angry at people who didn't comply. And all of a sudden, my chances of making any inroads went to zero. So these are some very, I think, important points as we talk to each other and engage with each other, because we have to create this movement from the ground up. And by the way, Paul, I also want to say that I really enjoy speaking to you, because you're one of the rare people that has looked at the entire, if you will, spectrum from the inner experience to the outer experience. And if there is anyone out there that is interested in mastery, go to the Spirit Gym. And I love that it's called the Spirit Gym, because we're invoking our spirit. Like we're just not meat suits here. And it
No.
goes all the way down from our inner energy system, but it also encompasses the entire world, esoteric to exoteric.
Yes.
And and there are very few people who have some element of mastery that have looked at both and realized that one is the reflection of the other. And I can't tell you how happy I am that you're here on the planet with us right now and giving voice to people like me and all of the other great guests that you have, because we're really saying something very, very important that is absolutely crucial that you're not going to find on other podcasts. So, with that, I would just want to say thank you for having me on and let me,
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I built Spirit Gym to address this very issue, all the things we've been talking about. I mean, it's really a deep a look at, a reality that's very hard for a lot of people to swallow. And without getting into a Spirit Gym podcast, I'll just say that the reality that's hard to follow is written right in the Bible. It's Isaiah 45:7. It says, I, the Lord, create the light and the dark. I create good and evil.
Yep.
I, the Lord, do all these things. And so in Spirit Gym, I say God is the myth maker that plays both sides and chooses neither. Choice is always left to you. And the reality of it is that whatever God is cannot become conscious without a duality. And you cannot have awareness of anything, self or other, without a duality. And we are in a field in which what we call God can only experience itself, and it cannot say no to evil, because otherwise it has no way to identify what the good is.
Yep.
So that the reality of it is that when you realize that we are all God manifest in human form, as is every living being in any dimension of reality that's sentient, whether it be a microorganism, a buffalo, a bobcat, or a tree, this is a Spirit Gym where, through interacting with the natural resistance that grows consciousness and grows awareness, that Great Spirit itself wakes up to itself. That's why I tell everybody, realize something. You are Ram Dass. Ram means God and Das means worker. We are all each agents of creation. We are even given creative agency. And it is only through being conscious. Steiner warned that people don't like to be conscious because they don't want the responsibility that comes with being aware of the fact that their choices have ramifications. They just want to play dead. And so I'm grateful that you recognize that. And I created Spirit Gym because of everything I saw going on in the world in the last 4 years. In fact, it was the day the pandemic started, the lockdown started, I said to Angie and Penny, I must make Spirit Gym happen immediately. And I worked my fucking ass off for the last 4.5 years to take 10 years of research and synthesize it down to what is now probably about 130 hours of online training with a community now 200 strong, that are people that really are ready to accept responsibility for their mind, for their emotions, for their creative agency, and for a deep understanding of the primacy of love and what love really is, and what our responsibility to ourselves and to each other in the world is. And so my podcast is really my attempt to find the most intelligent people that would have been the wise elders in a tribe like you, and say, this is somebody we've got to listen to, because they have depth of knowledge and breadth of knowledge and life experience. And it doesn't matter whether you agree or not.
Correct.
The reality of it is you can't make a choice unless you know it's on the menu. And if you start censoring people, then the menu just gets narrower and narrower. And when you do that in nature, it's called monocropping, and it kills diversity. And that's how you destroy life.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Preach, man. Preach.
It's not meant to preach. It's just
No, I'm saying
like it is for you. It's just hard. It's hard to watch all this. Like, I've got children, you've got kids.
Yep.
The problem with knowledge is there's real weight to it. Like, it's not hard for me to connect the dots. I grew up on a farm. When you start poisoning fields and poisoning water and poisoning air, you don't need to have a whole lot of brain cells holding hands to go, oh my God, I live in the milieu that's being poisoned here. So
yes, I know we're closing down here, but I love the fact, here's something to think about. Like, your audience knows about non-duality, but how, have you thought about what that means in terms of what is evil? As you said, the creator doesn't say no to anything. And I find it very, unfortunately, it holds you back when you hold on to the idea of evil. Like, we have to, there is no, this, as like the spirit, Jim, as you're saying, this is a crucible that we're in right now. Use it, not necessarily to save the world, but to save yourself and do something good. It's a spirit, Jim. It's a beautiful, beautiful analogy for what's going on right now. So I love it.
Thank you. Well, Madhava, where can people find more from you, your book? I know you've got a Substack.
Thank you. Yes. Well, you can read and buy the book, Woke and Anesthesiologist View. And for your listeners, it's almost it's an expansion of this podcast episode, which is to go through your biases first and put everything together before you approach the 9/11 topic. The 9/11 topic, to me, is the thread that will give you the most benefit if you start yanking on it. Everything comes down because you cannot ever reconcile the world as you see it with what you're being told. So thank you for allowing me to plug the book. I'm writing on my Substack, Madhava Setty, substack.com. The name of the newsletter is called An Insult to Intuition. I'm invoking the idea that we can find our way through this mess using a capacity we all have, which is our intuition. And I don't say your intuition, I say intuition in general, because I believe that, there is one mind, one collective intuition. And if we really examine our biases, we will collectively come to the right answer. And I suggest, honestly, if that was not the case, then we're screwed. Because if we can't tell ourselves, that means we are at the mercy of whoever has the most power, whoever has the biggest platform. We have that ability, and we have to nurture that. And that is the point of my writing.
Thank you, Madhava. And thank you to all of you who have listened this far. I hope you feel as we do, that these are very important topics and that we really need to get together collectively and wake up, clean up, grow up, and show up. And thank you to my sponsors for your excellent products. And thank you to all of you. If anything you buy from the sponsors puts money in the hands of people that put it in the hands of farmers that are doing a great job, that are taking care of our planet, rebuilding our topsoil, treating animals and plants ethically and morally, and creating great food and resources for all of us. And those are the people we've got to support. And that's the kind of model we have to start doing. And that's voting with the power of our own money and putting it into the hands of people that are doing good things with it. And I'm excited to share something with you next week. What it'll be, I don't know, but I'll do my very best to make it just as interesting as today. And lots of love to all of you. Aho. Thank you, Madhava.
Aho. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you for listening to Spirit Gym with Paul Chek and today's guest, Madhava Setty. You can find Madhava and his book, Woke, An Anesthesiologist's View, on his website at madhavasettymd.com. That's madhavasettymd.com. Read more from Madhava on his Substack site at madhavasetti.substack.com or connect with him on Instagram at SplinterInYourMind. You can also find out more about Madhava's work with Children's Health Defense at children'shealthDefense.org/authors/Madhava-Setty-M-D. For more of the resources mentioned in this episode, please visit the show notes page at paulchek.com/podcast, where you can also find details on the special offers from our premier sponsors, Bioptimizers, Wild Pastures, Paleo Valley, and Organifi, as well as links to Paul's social media, his YouTube channels, and his blog. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and a warm review on the podcast platform of your choice.